The grand courtroom of the Zarkai Empire was filled with tension. Golden pillars stretched toward the ceiling, and intricate carvings of past rulers decorated the walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, but no amount of fragrance could cover the stench of betrayal that filled the hall. Princess Valera stood in the center of the courtroom, bound in heavy iron chains. Her dark violet skin shimmered under the torchlight, but her golden eyes burned with defiance. She did not kneel. She did not lower her head. She stood tall, proud, unbroken. On the high throne, King Zorval, her father, glared down at her. His golden robe of authority flowed like liquid fire, and his massive horns curled around his head like a crown of power. His voice boomed through the courtroom. "Valera, daughter of the Zarkai Empire, you are accused of treason. You sided with the enemy. You shamed our people. What do you have to say for yourself?" Valera's lips curled into a small, fearless smile. "I did what was right," she said simply. The nobles gasped. The warriors growled in anger. The king's eyes darkened with fury. He raised his hand, ready to deliver the final judgment. Then the heavy doors of the courtroom burst open. A human walked inside. The court fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. Daniel Carter, a former diplomat and warrior of Earth, stepped forward without hesitation. He wore no armor, carried no weapons, yet he walked with the confidence of a man who feared nothing. His sharp blue eyes locked onto the king's. "I claim the princess," Daniel announced. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage, warriors reached for their weapons, and the king's fists tightened on his throne. King Zorval rose to his feet, his massive frame towering over the court. "You dare to claim my daughter? A mere human." His voice shook the very pillars of the courtroom. Daniel didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out an ancient scroll, sealed with the royal crest. He held it high for all to see. "The first claim law of the Zarkai Empire," Daniel said. "A law your ancestors created. It states that in times of war, a noble may be claimed by one who proves their worth, and by your own law, a claim must be honored." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The nobles looked at each other, uncertain. The warriors hesitated. They knew the law. They could not deny it. Valera's golden eyes widened in surprise. She had expected execution, not rescue. Least of all, from a human. The king's rage was a storm. "If you want her, human," he growled, "then you will earn her. You will face the trial of champions. And when you fail, your bones will decorate my throne." Daniel smirked. Challenge accepted. Valera stared at the human, her heart pounding. Who was this man? And why had he come for her? The courtroom was filled with noise, shouts of disbelief, laughter, and whispers of confusion. A human had dared to challenge the Zarkai Empire in its own court. It was unheard of. King Zorval stood tall on his golden throne, his dark red eyes burning with fury. His hands clenched the armrests so tightly that the stone cracked beneath his grip. He glared down at Daniel Carter, the human who had just claimed his daughter, Valera, before the entire court. The nobles laughed, their voices dripping with mockery. A weak human challenging the laws of the empire. One sneered, "He will not survive a single trial." Another chuckled, "This is an insult. He should be executed immediately." A warrior growled. But Daniel stood firm, his expression calm. He had faced worse. He had seen battle, had walked through fire, and had learned that the greatest weapon a human had was his mind. King Zorval's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "You think you can take my daughter by hiding behind ancient words. The first claim law is real, but no human has ever dared to use it." Daniel smirked. Maybe it's time someone did. The laughter faded. The court was no longer amused. Valera, still in chains, tilted her head slightly, studying him. Was this human a fool, or was he truly different from the others? The king's golden robes shimmered as he took a step forward. His voice was deep, like thunder before a storm. "Very well, human. You will have your chance, but you will prove your worth." He raised his hand, and the warriors of the court slammed their spears onto the floor, the sound echoing like a war drum. "The trial of champions will decide your fate," the king declared. "You will face 3 challenges: strength, cunning, and honor. Fail even one, and you die. Pass them all." He smirked, his sharp teeth glinting. "And the princess is yours." Daniel nodded, his face showing no fear. "Tell me where to start." The king gestured toward the arena entrance at the far side of the courtroom. The massive doors slowly creaked open, revealing a dark tunnel leading into the depths of the palace. "Your first trial begins now," the king announced. A massive Zarkai warrior stepped forward, his armor gleaming under the torchlight. He was twice Daniel's size, muscles like steel, his 4 arms flexing in preparation. He let out a deep growl, his voice like grinding stone. "I will crush you, human." Daniel cracked his neck and rolled his shoulders, his expression unreadable. He had fought bigger enemies before. He had survived worse odds. As he stepped forward, he glanced at Valera. Their eyes met for a brief second. She didn't speak, but something in her gaze changed. For the first time, she wondered, could this human actually win? The sound of the courtroom faded as Daniel Carter stepped into the arena. The massive stone walls surrounded him, torches flickering along the edges. The ground beneath his boots was rough, made of hardened sand, stained by the battles of countless warriors before him. Across from him stood his opponent, a Zarkai warlord named Gorvak. He was a monster of muscle and power, standing nearly 8 feet tall, his 4 arms flexing with raw strength. His armor was made of star-forged metal, unbreakable by normal means. The court above watched in amusement, whispering among themselves, "The human will be crushed within seconds. Gorvak once broke a battle cruiser in half. This won't even be a fight." The fool should have run when he had the chance. But Daniel didn't run. King Zorval raised his hand, signaling the fight to begin. "Let the first trial commence." With a deafening roar, Gorvak charged like a wild beast, his heavy footsteps shaking the arena. His 4 fists swung at Daniel, aiming to pulverize him into the ground. Daniel dodged. With the speed of a trained soldier, he rolled to the side just as Gorvak's massive fists smashed into the ground. The impact sent dust and debris flying, creating a small crater where Daniel had stood a moment before. The court gasped. Daniel moved swiftly, calculating every movement. He knew he couldn't match Gorvak in brute strength, but strength wasn't everything. Humans were small, fast, and clever. Gorvak turned, snarling, his yellow eyes full of fury. "Stop running, human," he bellowed, lunging again. This time, Daniel didn't dodge completely. Instead, he sidestepped at the last second and slammed his elbow into the alien's ribcage, using Gorvak's own momentum against him. The warlord stumbled, growling in frustration. The court murmured in surprise. The human was still standing. Gorvak roared, this time using all 4 arms at once, swinging wildly. Daniel ducked, rolled, and weaved between the attacks, staying just out of reach. He could feel the wind from each powerful strike, but he kept moving, never staying in one spot long enough to be hit. Then he saw it, a weakness. Gorvak's left knee was slightly slower to move, old injury, or just natural weakness. Daniel didn't care. He exploited it immediately. As Gorvak swung, Daniel slid underneath his legs and struck hard at the weak knee with all his strength. A loud crack echoed through the arena. The giant stumbled, his balance shaken. Daniel didn't hesitate. He jumped onto Gorvak's back, wrapped his arm around the alien's thick neck, and squeezed. A perfect chokehold. Gorvak thrashed, trying to throw him off, but Daniel held on, using every ounce of strength in his arms. The warlord gasped for air, his movements slowing. Then, he dropped to his knees. The court fell silent. Gorvak, the undefeatable warlord, had fallen to a human. King Zorval's expression darkened. Valera, still in chains, watched in stunned silence. Daniel released his grip and stepped back. Trial of strength complete. The human had won. The grand courtroom was silent. Every noble, every warrior, every servant watched in stunned disbelief. A human had just defeated one of the strongest warlords of the Zarkai Empire. King Zorval clenched his fists. His pride was wounded, his anger barely controlled. He wanted nothing more than to strike the human down, but the law bound him. Valera, still in chains, looked at Daniel Carter with something new in her golden eyes. Not just curiosity, but something close to respect. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. The fight had taken a toll, but he wasn't done yet. The king's deep voice boomed across the hall. The human has won the trial of strength. But brute force is not enough. Now he must prove his mind is worthy. The second trial was about to begin. The game of minds. Daniel was led to a circular chamber deep within the palace. In the center was a massive stone table with a holographic projection floating above it. A Zarkai strategist, General Zalthar, stood waiting. Unlike the warlord before, Zalthar was lean and calculating, his sharp purple eyes filled with intelligence. The trial of cunning, Zalthar said, his voice smooth. A battle of strategy and deception. We play the game of Tsukar, the oldest test of the mind in our empire. Daniel studied the board. It was a three-dimensional strategy game, similar to chess, but far more complex. The pieces floated and changed shape, reacting to the player's choices. The nobles whispered among themselves. The human is finished. No outsider has ever won at Tsukar. This is where he will fail. Daniel smiled slightly. He had seen this game before, not exactly the same, but close. Back on Earth, he had played something similar in high-stakes negotiations. He sat across from Zalthar. Begin. A battle of wits. Zalthar moved first, placing his pieces in a traditional defensive formation. A solid strategy used by the best players. Daniel took his time, watching how the pieces shifted, how the holograms reacted. Then he placed his own pieces, not in defense, but in a trap. The court murmured. Zalthar smirked. An aggressive opening. Bold, but foolish. The game continued. Zalthar played with calculated precision, while Daniel played with instinct and unpredictability. Piece by piece, Daniel baited his opponent, making risky moves that no Zarkai would dare attempt. Zalthar narrowed his eyes. The game board shifted. His pieces were cornered. The court leaned forward. Daniel moved his final piece. The board flashed. Checkmate. The chamber erupted in shock. Zalthar's face darkened. He had lost. King Zorval's jaw tightened. Valera, still watching, exhaled slowly. The human won again. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. Trial of cunning complete. The final test awaited. The grand hall was silent. Daniel Carter had done the impossible. He had defeated the Zarkai warlord in strength and outmaneuvered a master strategist in cunning. The nobles and warriors of the Zarkai Empire no longer laughed at him. King Zorval sat rigid on his golden throne, his red eyes burning with anger. He could feel the court shifting, doubt creeping into their minds. This human had not only survived, but had won twice. Princess Valera, still bound in chains, watched Daniel carefully. He had fought for her, risked his life in these trials. But why? What did he gain from this? The king rose to his feet. His voice was deep and dangerous. You have proven your strength and your mind, human, but these are not enough. A ruler must have honor. And so, your final trial begins. Daniel remained calm. What's the test? The king snapped his fingers. 2 guards stepped forward, dragging in a Zarkai prisoner, a thin, injured warrior with bruises covering his body. He had clearly been beaten, barely able to stand. The king's eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. Kill him, the court gasped. Valera's breath caught. Daniel frowned. What? This warrior is a traitor, Zorval explained. He betrayed our empire, just as you claim my daughter did. If you wish to prove your honor, execute him. The court leaned forward, waiting for Daniel's response. Would the human obey? Would he hesitate? Would he refuse and fail the trial? The human's choice. Daniel stared at the prisoner. The man was weak, trembling, but he refused to beg. His yellow eyes met Daniel's with silent acceptance. Daniel's jaw tightened. Slowly, he reached for the blade the guard held out for him. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision. Then he dropped the blade onto the ground. The court gasped in shock. Zorval's eyes narrowed. You refuse. Daniel stood tall. I came here to fight for Valera's freedom, not to execute helpless prisoners. Honor isn't about blind obedience. It's about doing what is right. The court erupted into whispers. Some looked impressed, others furious. The king's expression darkened. He had expected the human to fail, to either obey like a coward or refuse out of weakness. Instead, Daniel had made a stand, and the court had witnessed it. Valera, watching closely, felt something stir in her chest. This human, he was different. The king had no choice. With a reluctant nod, he turned to the court. His voice was like a storm. The trial of honor, complete. Daniel had won. And now, the fate of the princess was in his hands. The trial was over, and the court was in chaos. Daniel Carter had passed all 3 trials, strength, cunning, and honor, and had earned the right to claim Princess Valera as his own. The court buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and admiration, but also anger. King Zorval sat on his throne, his face a mask of fury. His empire was on the brink of change, and the human had become the symbol of that change. Valera, still in chains, stood by Daniel. Her golden eyes were filled with something new, respect. She had watched him fight, think, and stand up for what was right. But as she looked at her father, she knew the danger wasn't over. The king would not easily accept defeat. As the nobles and warriors continued to argue, a shadow moved in the corners of the room. 2 figures slipped silently from the darkness. The king's closest advisors, Vrax and Serena, had been watching Daniel's every move. They had seen his success in the trials, and they knew that their king would never allow him to walk away with the princess. Serena, a powerful sorceress, whispered something to Vrax, who nodded. The plan was set. The human was too dangerous. His presence threatened the stability of the empire. They would need to act quickly, before the king's rage could turn into action. Meanwhile, Daniel stood beside Valera, still processing the weight of what had just happened. His heart was heavy, knowing that although he had won, he had unleashed something much bigger than just a challenge for the princess. The entire empire now knew who he was. I didn't expect this, Daniel said, his voice low. I didn't think they would accept me, let alone let me live. Valera gave him a sharp look. The Zarkei Empire does not easily accept humans, but your actions have forced them to respect you. Daniel glanced around the room. The nobles and warriors who had once mocked him now whispered among themselves, their expressions mixed with fear and awe. But his victory had made him a target. He could feel the danger growing in the air. The court was no longer just watching the princess. Now, they were watching him, waiting for him to slip. Suddenly, Serena and Vrax appeared before them. Without a word, Serena raised her hands, and a dark mist began to swirl around the room. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He reached for his weapon, but the sorceress had already cast her spell. The world around him began to spin. The air grew heavy, and his vision blurred. Before he could react, he collapsed to the ground, his mind swimming in confusion. Valera screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the dark magic that consumed them both. As Daniel fell unconscious, Vrax's cold laugh echoed through the room. The human has served his purpose. Now it's time to rid the empire of him. The world felt like it was spinning. Daniel Carter's mind struggled to stay afloat, each moment clouded in darkness. He could barely see, his body felt numb, and his senses were overloaded. Every part of him wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The dark mist that had engulfed him weighed on him like 1,000 tons. Somewhere, far away, he heard a voice. "Daniel, wake up." It was Valera. Her voice cut through the fog in his mind. He tried to focus, tried to move, but his body refused to obey. Then, through the haze, he felt something, a sharp pain in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was too strong. But then, he heard her again. "Daniel, listen to me. You cannot stay down. You must wake up." With everything he had left, Daniel forced himself to open his eyes. The world around him was blurry, shadows moving. He could see Valera's face, her golden eyes wide with panic. She was kneeling beside him, her chains still on, but her hands were shaking as she tried to help him. "What happened?" Daniel rasped, his voice weak and strained. Valera quickly glanced around the room, her eyes darting nervously. The court chamber was no longer bustling. The nobles were gone, and only a few guards remained, silent, tense. "It was a trap, Daniel," she said urgently. "Vrax and Serena, the king's advisors, betrayed us." Daniel's mind began to clear, his senses slowly returning. He realized that something was wrong. The dark mist in the room had already started to fade, but it had left a heavy feeling in the air. "They betrayed us," Daniel repeated, trying to stand. But his body was still weak, and the pain from the dark magic lingered. Valera helped him sit up. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "They've always wanted to control everything. The king is blinded by his pride, and they know that with you here, things could change. They couldn't allow it." Daniel blinked, trying to focus. "But why didn't the king?" "He doesn't know." Valera's voice was tense. "They acted before he could. They know how much power they hold over him. They wanted to make sure you wouldn't be a threat." Daniel's anger began to stir. "So they tried to kill me. Not kill you. Control you. They were going to use their magic to trap your mind, to make you forget everything." Daniel clenched his fists, the fire of rage starting to build inside him. He had come so far, endured so much, only to be tricked like this. He could feel his strength returning, bit by bit. The dark magic had weakened him, but it hadn't broken him. "We have to stop them," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "We can't let them get away with this." Valera nodded, determination filling her eyes. She looked around cautiously, making sure no one else was watching. "I know a way out. If we move quickly, we can get to the lower levels of the palace. That's where they hide their magic." Daniel finally stood up, with Valera's help. His legs were shaky, but he could feel his strength growing with each passing second. "Let's go. We don't have time." As they moved quietly through the dark halls of the palace, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The betrayal had just begun, and now they had to face it head-on. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. The silence of the palace was unsettling. Daniel and Valera moved swiftly through the dark hallways, each step echoing softly off the stone walls. The weight of betrayal hung heavily in the air, and the tension between them was thick. They knew time was running out. Vrax and Serena were too powerful to be ignored, and their plans were already in motion. As they reached the lower levels of the palace, Daniel could feel the cold air growing thicker. There was something unnatural about this part of the castle, a sense of magic so dark it seemed to seep through the walls. This was where the true power of the Zarkai Empire was hidden, where secrets of the royal bloodline and forbidden magic were kept. "We're close." Valera's voice was barely a whisper. She glanced at him, her golden eyes serious. "This is where they hide their magic, where they control the empire." Daniel nodded, his muscles tense. He could feel the danger in the air, a sense that they were being watched. "We need to destroy it. If we don't, they'll use it against us. Valera's expression softened for a moment, but only for a moment. She knew the risks, and she knew this was the only way to end the growing threat of the king's advisors. Vrax and Serena had gone too far. They had played with dark magic for too long. At the end of the hall, the door to the Chamber of Magic loomed ahead. It was made of thick stone, covered in ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. This is it. Valera took a deep breath. If we destroy their magic source, they'll lose their hold over the Empire. But be careful. This place is protected by spells I'd never seen before. Daniel turned to her, his voice steady. I'm not afraid of magic. I've fought far worse. They approached the door together. As Valera reached out to touch the ancient symbols, they suddenly flared to life, sending a surge of energy across the room. Daniel instinctively reached for his weapon, but Valera stopped him with a firm grip. Wait, she whispered urgently. We can't fight magic directly, but we can disrupt it. She closed her eyes, her focus intense. Slowly, her hands began to glow with golden energy, her connection to the Empire's magic pulsing. The symbols on the door responded, shifting and reshaping to match her energy. Suddenly, the door slammed open with a loud crash. On the other side, standing in the heart of the room, was Serena, her eyes glowing with power, her smile twisted with satisfaction. So, you've made it this far. Serena's voice was cold, almost mocking. But this is where it ends. Before Daniel could react, Vrax appeared beside her, his tall, imposing figure blocking the doorway. You should have stayed out of it, human, he growled. Now you'll face the consequences. Valera stepped forward, standing beside Daniel. We don't have time for your games, Vrax. This ends now. The air around them crackled with tension, as if the entire palace was holding its breath. Serena raised her hands, and dark energy swirled around her. You think you can stop us? She sneered. You're nothing. And now you'll see what happens when you defy the Zarkai Empire. Daniel met her gaze, his eyes burning with resolve. I don't care about your empire. I care about Valera, and I'll destroy anyone who tries to take her from me. With a sudden burst of energy, Daniel lunged forward, aiming for Serena. At the same time, Valera's golden power surged, disrupting the dark magic that surrounded the chamber. The room exploded in a blinding flash of light. The room was a storm of light and shadow. Daniel and Valera moved as one, their energy and determination blending into a powerful force. The dark magic swirling around them crackled in the air, but they refused to be overwhelmed. They had come too far to turn back now. Serena, the sorceress, stood in the center of the chamber, her hands raised high. Her eyes glowed with an intense, unnatural light as she summoned all the dark power she could muster. You should have never come here, human, she hissed, her voice filled with venom. The energy around her surged, and dark tendrils of magic shot out, aiming directly at Daniel and Valera. But Valera, with her own inner strength, countered with a flash of golden light, deflecting the magic. The energy crashed against the walls, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Daniel's heart raced. Every moment was a battle for survival. He glanced at Valera. She was doing her best to fight back, but he knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed to end it, and quickly. We have to stop her, Daniel shouted, his voice firm. Valera nodded, her eyes full of resolve. We will. At that moment, Vrax, the king's loyal advisor, stepped forward. His tall form was almost menacing in the dim light, his cold eyes fixed on Daniel. You think you can take control of the empire, human? He sneered. You are nothing. The king will crush you all. Vrax's voice was filled with contempt as he reached for his weapon, a long, jagged blade that seemed to hum with dark energy. You should never have crossed the Zarkai. Daniel didn't hesitate. He drew his own blade and faced Vrax with a steady hand. I'm not afraid of you, or the king. In the blink of an eye, they clashed. The sound of metal ringing against metal echoed through the chamber, and sparks flew as their blades met. Vrax was strong, but Daniel was fast. He dodged a powerful strike and retaliated with a swift counterattack, forcing Vrax back. Valera, meanwhile, was focused on Serena. She could feel the magic pulsing in the air, pushing against her, trying to overpower her will. But she wasn't about to give up. She raised her hands, gathering every ounce of strength she had. "This ends now, Serena." With a final shout, Valera released a burst of golden energy so powerful it sent Serena flying across the room. The sorceress hit the wall with a crash, and the dark magic around her seemed to wither and die. Serena's face twisted in shock and fury. "No, this can't be." She tried to rise, but it was too late. The magic had been broken. The room was quiet, save for the sound of Daniel and Vrax's fight. Daniel's movements were quick, fluid, and precise. With a final strike, he disarmed Vrax, knocking the weapon from his hands. Vrax stumbled back, gasping for breath, his face red with rage. Valera stood tall, her energy still crackling in the air. "It's over," she said softly, but with absolute certainty. Daniel walked over to her, his chest heaving from the fight. He offered her a nod, his expression one of quiet pride. They had won. The sorceress and the advisor were defeated. The magic that had threatened them was no more. But the battle was not just about power. It was about honor and freedom. Valera turned to Daniel, her eyes meeting his with a look of deep gratitude. "Thank you, human." Daniel smiled, feeling the weight of their journey lift. "We did this together." Now, the future of the Zarkai Empire was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The echoes of battle had faded, and the chamber was now still. Daniel stood beside Valera, breathing heavily from the intense fight, but a sense of relief settled in his chest. He had fought for her, for the right to be by her side, and now it seemed they had finally won. The Zarkai Empire had been shaken to its core. The once powerful and feared advisors, Vrax and Serena, were defeated. The dark magic that had nearly torn them apart had been destroyed. But even in victory, there was still a sense of uncertainty in the air. The king had not yet been defeated. Valera turned to Daniel, her golden eyes searching his face. Her chains were gone now, her hands free, but she still stood with the same calm and determined strength that had defined her throughout their journey. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with purpose. Daniel looked at her, taking the deep breath. "Now, we change everything." They had broken the chains of betrayal, defeated the magic that had once held the Empire in control, and stood together. But there was still much to be done. King Zorval, although humiliated, was still a dangerous force. The rest of the Empire's leaders would likely seek to challenge their authority. "We have to face the king," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We can't leave him on the throne, not after everything he's done." Valera nodded, her eyes narrowing. "I know. He will never accept a human ruling beside me, but I'm not afraid to fight for what's right." Just then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. Daniel's instincts flared, and he quickly reached for his weapon. Valera raised her hand, signaling him to stop. A group of Zarkai soldiers appeared, but instead of attacking, they knelt before her. "Princess Valera, we have witnessed your bravery. We've seen the strength of your heart, and we no longer bow to the corrupt rule of your father. We will stand with you." The words hit Valera like a wave. She had always known the people of her empire were strong, but she had never imagined they would rally behind her like this. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but then he smiled. This was the moment they had been fighting for. The empire was finally turning. Valera stepped forward, her voice full of command and hope. "Together, we will make this empire better. It will no longer be ruled by fear and darkness. We will create a new future." Daniel stood beside her, a sense of pride filling his chest. He had come to this world as an outsider, a simple human, and now he was a part of something far bigger than himself. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a new beginning. The battle for the future of the Zarkai Empire was far from over, but now, for the first time, it felt like hope was within their grasp. The king's reign was coming to an end, and Valera and Daniel would lead the charge into the new dawn. As the soldiers rose and cheered, Daniel looked at Valera, his partner in every sense. He had come to this world as an unknown human, but now, with her by his side, he had found his place in the galaxy. "We've won," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "And together, we'll make sure the Empire never falls into darkness again." The future was theirs, and they would face it, side by side, as equals.